Hello and most welcome to 1207. I would begin today a little recap with Chris Field. He written a very interesting article about eigenform interfaces and holographic encoding. And it's together with Donald D. Hoffman, Chetan Prakash, and Robert Pretner. So he is in good company, so to speak, without doubt. Context. Let's move this a bit here. The evolution of perceptual systems and hence of observers remains largely disconnected from the question of emergence of classical objects and spacetime. This connection between the biosciences and physics impedes progress toward understanding the role of the observer in physical theory. In this article, we consider the problem of how to understand objects and space-time in observer relative evolutionary terms. Method. We rely on comparative analysis using multiple formal frameworks. The eigenform construct of von Förster is compared to other formal representations of observer-environment interactions. Eigenforms are shown to be encoded on observer-environment interfaces and to encode fitness consequences of actions. Space and time are components of observational outcomes in this framework. It suggested that space-time constitutes an error-correcting code for fitness consequences. Our result contributes to an understanding of the world in which neither objects nor space-time are observer independent. Constructivist content. The eigenform concept of von Förster is linked to the concepts of decoherence and holographic encoding from physics and the concept of fitness from evolutionary biology. So we have keywords already here: active inference, boundary, conscious agent, icon, Markov blanket, redundancy. Heinz von Förster introduced the eigenform and eigenbehavior concepts by considering an agent that both observes and acts on a surrounding world. An eigenform is an observation that remains invariant in the limit of long interaction time under some class of behaviors, while eigenbehavior is an action that in the same limit leaves some eigenform invariance. These concepts naturally suggest an abstract picture in which the eigenbehavior continually reproduces the eigenform. independently of any features or dynamics of the world. In this picture, eigenform and eigenbehavior compose a single reflexive system. All other aspects of the world can be neglected. These concepts naturally suggest an abstract picture in which the eigenbehavior continually reproduces the eigenform, independently of any other features or dynamics of the world. In this picture, eigenform and eigenbehavior compose a single reflexive system. All other aspects of the world can be neglected. Louis Kaufmann has shown, conversely, that all such reflexive systems have eigenforms and eigenbehaviors as invariants. Kaufmann elevates the reflexivity of such self-reproducing eigenform, eigenbehavior systems to a principle of cosmology. Quote, "The universe is constructed in such a way that it can refer to itself, and the universe can pretend that it is two, and then let itself refer to the two, and find that it has, in the process, referred only to the one, that is, itself." It's a take from Louis Kaufmann. This formulation makes explicit an important point, that there is no difference in substance, and hence no metaphysical dualism between agent and environment. Here we pursue the notion of an eigenform, not from the perspective of an abstract reflexive system, but rather from von Foerster's original perspective of an agent that observes and acts on the world. A world that can be taken to be the rest of the universe in which the agent is embedded. We impose, in other words, an epistemic cut in the sense used by John von Neumann or Howard Petit. Between agent and the world for the purposes of theory construction. It is from this perspective that an eigenform becomes, or perhaps better, serves as an object that the agent observes and acts with respect to. This agent-centered perspective, when combined with the essential external perspective of the theorist, allows us to consider the ecological situation of an agent for whom every observation presents multiple objects, every object allows multiple actions, and every pairing of an object with an action has consequences that may be good or bad for the agent. We compare the description of this situation in terms of eigenforms to its description in two independently developed formal representations of the agent-world interaction. The conscious agent formalism of Donald Hoffman and Chetan Prakash, and the Markov blanket formalism of Judea Pearl, as applied to biological systems by Carl Friston. In both of these latter representations, the agent's observations and actions pass through a boundary or interface that separates the agent, even if this separation is purely notional, from the observed world. We show that eigenforms can be regarded as icons, specifying possible interactions that are encoded on this interface. We then suggest that this notion of an encoding of information about possible interactions on an interface is in fact very general. By showing that it corresponds to the notion of holography developed within quantum information theory. In this case, the encoding can be regarded as recorded by the process of quantum decoherence, confirming the close relationship between the eigenform concept and quantum theory already suggested by Hoffman. Considering eigenforms as encodings of information for a particular agent on that agent's interface with its observed world allows us to ask what information an eigenform encodes. If perceived objects are tokens for eigenforms, what is their informational role? In the interface theory of perception, ITP of Hoffman, Manish Singh and Prakash provide a prima facie surprising answer that objects do not encode information about the ontological or causal structure of the world, but rather information about the structure of the fitness function that relates the agent to the world. This information is object relative, but not object specific. An interaction with one object can have fitness consequences that affect interactions with other objects. An eigenform, in other words, encodes information not just about its own stability, but also about the stability of other eigenforms. What kind of encoding, we then ask, can have this property? We suggest that space-time itself, including both the space in which objects appear to be embedded and the time over which they appear to persist, is a relational error-correcting code for the fitness consequences of interactions. The forms and locations of objects in space encode probabilistic information about what future interactions with these or other objects, if they occur at all, may be like. The persistence of an object in time encodes the robustness of the corresponding eigenform as an attractor. Eigenforms have evolved, we argue, to make this encoding of future consequences as precise as possible, given the energetic and other resource constraints of the encoding interface. The interface. As von Förster recognized, a reflexive model escapes solipsism when the world or environment of each agent includes other agents, or in the limit is another agent. From the perspective of either agent, the other agent is its entire world, and every observation appears to be an observation of this entire world. There is nothing else with which the agent interacts, and hence nothing else that it observes. It is only from the perspective of a theorist describing the overall situation from the outside that the two agents and their exchange of observations within a closed loop system can be made explicit. The closed loop two-agent exchange in figure 1a, as depicted in the paper here, involves an apparent paradox. Each agent receives information from the other, so that the total information in a two-agent system appears to increase. Any such increase in a closed system, as von Förster notes, appears to violate the second law of thermodynamics. Indeed, any agent, as a self-organizing system, must eat energy and order from its environment. In order to survive from the perspective of any such agent, the order in its environment must decrease as it is eaten. The environment of either agent in figure 1a is the other agent. Hence, each agent must perceive the other as losing information. It is here that the difference between the agents and the theorist's perspectives become critically important. As Max Tegmark 2012 remarks in a similar context, neither agent has observational access to the total entropy of the two systems. Neither agent has the theorist's perspective, and neither agent can get outside the system to measure the total entropy. The total entropy of the two-agent system could be zero, as indeed it would be if the agents were quantum mechanical systems with an entangled joint state. In this case, each agent would see itself communicating, but an outside observer would see no communication, as discussed further below. It's only the agent's principled lack of observational access to the system in which they are embedded that allows each agent to consider itself to be gaining information at the expense of its environment. Hence, the second law is respected from each agent's individual perspective. This comports well with the probabilities that appear in the second law, being subjective, not objective. The lack of observational access that rescues Figure 1 from the paradox has a second important consequence. The environment of each agent becomes a classical black box, a system to which observers have only external access. More formally, a classical black box is a system about which no observer can have more non-hypothetical information than is contained in a finite list of finite length bit strings representing observed input-output transitions. Because neither agent can see inside the black box of its environment. This is, after all, what no observational access means. Neither agent knows what its environment contains. The two agents of Figure 1a can therefore also be represented as two interacting black boxes. We give them their traditional names, Alice and Bob. Alice gives inputs to the unknown system, Bob, and receives outputs in return. The situation is the same from Bob's point of view. Bob's point of view. Edward Moore's theorem assures that neither Alice nor Bob can determine the complete state space or dynamics of the other from finite output-input observations. Either must, therefore, regard the other as a non-trivial machine, i.e., as a system whose behavior is unpredictable in principle, as von Fürsters emphasizes. Principal unpredictability is considered by some to indicate an autonomy or free will, and hence agency from the perspective of external observer. Even infants associate agency with behavior in unpredictability. Any black box can, on this view, be considered to be, or at least contain, an agent. The inability of any observer of a black box to determine where in the box an enclosed agent is, or how much of the box in the enclosed agent occupies, is what allows the limiting case in which the other agent is the box, and hence what allows the two-agent representation in figure 1b. The position of the boundary S separating Alice from Bob in figure 1b is like the total entropy of the joint Alice plus Bob system, definable only from the God's eye perspective of the theorists. Moving the boundary changes the sizes of Alice and Bob, and hence their definition as systems. It also changes what counts for each of them as an input or an output. However, moving the boundary S changes nothing about the relationship of mutual exchange between Alice and Bob, and indeed nothing about the behavior of the joint system they compose. This invariance under changes in the positions of boundaries drawn by theorists is built deeply into the formalism of both classical and quantum physics. It is indeed this invariance that allows theorists to choose systems of interests arbitrarily. Its implicity von Fürsters and Kaufmann's reduction of the agent-environment dynamics to the reflexive dynamics of a single unitary system. The Alice and Bob boundary being arbitrarily movable means that Alice and Bob do not know and cannot determine where in the joint system their mutual boundary is. Each can only locate the boundary from her or his own perspective. the God's eye perspective needed to locate it within the joint system is unavailable. Not only can they not observe the interior of their interaction partner environment, they cannot observe the boundary separating themselves from their partner environment. All that either Alice or Bob can observe is the sequence of inputs that cross their respective boundaries from their respective environments. These sequences of inputs are the totality of their perceptual as opposed to internally generated or introspected experiences. As agents, Alice and Bob not only perceive but also act. Eigenforms are fixed points of and hence encode regularities in the perception-action relationship. Why should such regularities exist? From the theorist's point of view, eigenforms are inevitably, as shown by von Förster and made more explicit by Kaufmann, such proof does not, however, say which eigenforms are inevitable. From an agent's perspective, an eigenform is an eigenpercept, a percept that does not change when the right action, the eigenbehavior, is executed. Such an eigenpercept has persistence over time. If the right action is taken, the wrong action may lead to its disappearance. An autonomous agent must choose the right action to take in any particular circumstance, i.e., given any combination of current state and current percept. To the eigenform eigenbehavior concept, therefore, we may add the notion of an eigendecision. Yes, the decision to execute the eigenbehavior that results in the renewal of the eigenform. While autonomy in the non-trivial machine sense inferred above is somewhat abstract, a requirement for autonomous decision-making at least suggests an awareness of potential consequences and hence consciousness. A minimal formal model of conscious agent, a so-called CA, that experiences perceptual input from the world W in which it is embedded, decides between possible actions to take on the basis of that input, and then executes the selected action of W has been developed by Hoffman and Prakash, who show that this minimal model is computationally universal. They propose as the thesis of conscious realism that the world W can always be considered to itself be a CA. that is a conscious agent. In this case, the agent-world interaction can be represented as in figure 1c. Conscious realism incorporates clearly the assumption discussed above that the limit in which the other agents fills the entire environment exists. As in the case of a black box agent, this assumption can be stated as a claim about observational access. No agent can demonstrate by observation that its environment or any component thereof is not also a conscious agent. Conscious realism makes each agent's action the other agent's perception in figure 1c, just as they are in figures 1a and 1b. In either agent's case, the space X of experiences contains all of the information on which its choices of actions, which are assumed to be autonomous and hands-free, may be based, including any memories, values, goals, and other introspectively accessible content. It is important to emphasize that a CA does not experience the operations P, D, or A. But only the elements of the experience space X. An account of how experiences are written on X is discussed below. The analog of figure 1c of the arbitrarily movable interagent boundary S in figure 1b is the purely notional point at which Alice's action A becomes Bob's perception P, and vice versa. Consistent with the discussion above, this point is invisible. From Bob's perspective, Alice acts directly on his experience space X, Bob. Similarly for Alice, we can therefore simply identify the two oriented surfaces of the boundary S, the surface facing Bob and the surface facing Alice, with the experience spaces X Bob and X Alice respectively. In this case, Alice and Bob each act outwardly through their own experience spaces on the experience space of others. Note that making this identification of the two surfaces of S with the experience spaces X Bob and X Alice renders Alice and Bob neither open nor close. In the mereotopological sense, Alice and Bob rather than share a single boundary that belongs to neither of them. Treating each agent's outward action on the other agent as experienced by the agent performing the action requires giving the space X a structure that allocates some part of X for the recording of at least short-term memories of executed actions. Recording each action as it is executed, even if this record is forgotten immediately thereafter, is the minimal requirement for experience learning and hence for experientially understanding or expecting anything about the environment. It is similarly the minimal requirement for any experience of acting, that is, of being an agent. The idea that interacting agents interact via a shared, epistemically impenetrable boundary has been formulated independently by Friston, who provides an analog using Pearl's Markov blanket formalism of the von Förster-Kaufmann demonstration that eigenforms are inevitable. A Markov blanket is a collection of nodes, such that knowing the state of this collection renders the state of the two sets of nodes interacting only via the blanket conditionally independent. Shows that a Markov blanket appears whenever a random dynamical system is factored into parts. The blanket effectively encodes information about how the actions of one system affects the state of the other. It thus translates Alice's actions into Bob's perceptions and vice versa, just as the boundary S does in figure 1b. It plays the role that von Förster assigns, in a very general sense, to language. Either agent's interactions with its own surface of the blanket can be described in terms of Bayesian active interference, in which the agent can choose, given any percept, either to alter his expectations about the world, i.e., about the probabilities of future percepts, or to act in some way that changes the percepts. This conceptualization of the agent's potential responses to a percept has led to architectural predictions in both neuroscience, from Adams, Friston and Bastos, and development biology, coming from Friston et al. The idea that perceptions, in the broad sense of informational inputs from the world, appear on a surface separating an agent from the world on which it acts, a surface that not only presents information and enables actions, but also block further epistemic access to what is on the other side, immediately suggest a familiar analogy, the user interface of a computer. Like the surface in figure 1b, the user interface of a computer presents all of the information about the computer's internal state that the user can access without disrupting the computer's function. User interfaces provide highly abstracted representations of the computer's internal state, each of which allows a circumscribed set of possible actions. They systematically hide not just the behavioral complexity, but the entire physical and causal structure of the computer. User interfaces are moreover ambiguous about this structure by design, as with any virtual machine. Platform independence is a major component of user interface utility. Computer programs are by no means alone in having these properties, as Willard van Orman Quine points out. All human natural languages have them. If a model theoretic approach to semantics is adopted, all languages of any kind have them. A computer's user interface, however, obviously has them, which is what makes it a particular good analogy. The interface theory of perception challenges the still dominant assumption that human perception is at least approximately veridical. With the claim that human perception and action are interactions with the user interface formed of conscious experience in that systematically hides both the ontology and the causal structure of the world. As stable action-perception associations, Eigenforms live on this interface. The icons and windows of computer interface are placed there by designers. There is, however, no designers in ITP. We discuss in the next section how information can be encoded on an internal by the process of information exchange. Internally by the process of information exchange itself. And this leads us to holographic encoding. Holographic encoding. Objects as spatially bounded, temporally persistent, internally cohesive, causally independent entities This is very good. Not only the cookie, sorry about that, but also what's written here. Objects as spatially bounded, temporally persistent, listen to this, internally cohesive, causally independent entities are simply taken for granted as part of the classical worldview. Roughly corresponding to what Edmund Husserl called the natural attitude, on which human material culture is largely based. This classical conception of objecthood is so critical to ordinary human cognition that it is widely regarded as innate. Albert Einstein viewed the boundedness, persistence, and causal independence of object as critical to science, claiming that without such an assumption of the mutually independent existence, the being thus of spatially distant things, an assumption which originates in everyday thought, physical thought in the sense familiar to us, would not be possible. Excellently put by Einstein, I would say. Niels Bohr emphasized that items of laboratory apparatus must be regarded as classical objects if the notion of an observational outcome is to make sense. Eugen Wigner's friend paradox nicely illustrates the consequences within the classical worldview of not treating other observers as bounded, persistent objects. They not only lose any claim to consciousness and hence observerhood, they become entangled with the rest of the world and effectively disappear. The assumption of epistemic transparency and objective persistence over time underlying the classical worldview has been criticized at least since Heraclitus. Well, quantum theory, however, forcefully raises the question of how it could even be possible to experience spatially bounded, temporally persistent, internally cohesive, causally independent entities. While some physicists still reject it, for instance Girardi and of course Weinberg, unitary quantum theory with no scale-dependent physical collapse mechanism is increasingly supported by both experiment and theoretical considerations. And there among we have people who we usually object to, like Susskind and Tegmark, but obviously Tegmark is following that principle. But the way he takes after that, I don't, well, it's in unitary quantum theory, the universe is permanently in an entangled state. There are no classical objects. No. Who said that many a time? Åge Bohr. While the appearance of classicality in such a universe is given multiple explanations, since the 1980s, most have appealed in some way to a process of decoherence. That is, an apparent removal of quantum coherence that results in an apparently classical object in an apparently classical state. Three views of decoherence process are shown in figure 2. In the original environment-induced decoherence process of Dieter C, an environment such as the macroscopic apparatus or the ambient photon field interacts continuously with both the observer and the system being observed. This interaction effectively removes quantum coherence from both observers and system by spreading of the many unobserved and in practice unobservable states of environment. This is formally the degrees of freedom of the environment are traced over, with both observer and observed system now in effectively classical states. Formally, eigenstates of the respective interaction Hamiltonians with the environment. Both the preparation and the measurement interactions are effectively classical. As pointed out by, amongst other, Harold Olivier and David Poulin. However, observers typically interact with systems of interest only via an apparatus or an ambient field, such as the photon field. This intervening environment serves as a witness that both decoheres the system and encodes information about its state. Formally, information about the eigenstates of the system-environment interaction Hamiltonian in a way that is accessible to the observer, indeed to multiple independent observers, via an effectively classical interaction. In this picture, the witnessing environment does all the work of observation. The human observers read their observational outcomes off from the environment in the same way that they would read them out of a shared or multiplied copied book. While the indirectly observed system is quantum, the directly observed components of the environment constitute, in this case, an effectively classical object that stands between the observer and the quantum system of interest. The environments as witness formulation of decoherence assumes that the observer knows and can characterize the system environment boundary. The intervening environment is, in other words, assumed to be at least epistemically transparent. What happens if this assumption of a transparent environment is rejected? In this case, the environment becomes a black box. Any systems are contained fully within it in such a way that their boundaries, if they have them, are observationally inaccessible. From the observer's perspective, it is completely consistent with all available observational outcomes to treat the system as expanding to fill the entire environment. This is precisely the limiting case discussed above. If the system environment boundary cannot be defined, however, a decoherence interaction between system and environment cannot be defined either. Decoherence can, in this case, only be defined at the observer-environment boundary, that is, at the interface characterized above. This process is illustrated in Figure 3. The quantum state Psi passes through the interface to produce an observational outcome X. This outcome is defined at the observer-environment boundary. If receiving the observational outcome X is to have any determinate effect on the observer, that is, if it is to be an input to a decision process that selects a next action to perform, then it must be a classical outcome. To characterize X as classical is just to say that decoherence actually happens. Hence, it is to say that the observer environment in interaction actually occurs from the perspective of both observer and environment. A classical outcome can be recorded as a classical bit string, that is, a finite sequence of binary numbers. Indeed, it must be recorded in a thermodynamically irreversible way if it is to be considered to have a causal effect. Where is it encoded? In the CA model, it is encoded on the space X of experiences. As discussed above, this space X can simply be identified with the interface. Hence, we can regard the classical observational outcome value xi as encoded on the interface itself. Encodings of classical information, that is information that can be written as a finite bit string on surfaces at which interactions are defined, are called holographic by physicists. Such holographic encodings were first characterized for the surfaces bounded by event horizons of black holes, and were extended to the surface of the observable universe as a whole by Gerhard Hopf and Susskind. Holographic encoding records on the surface of a system all of the information that may be obtained from it by observation. To say that the system has a holographic encoding is to say that its observationally accessible information content is proportional to its surface area, not to its volume. While the terms surface area and volume here suggest ordinary three-dimensional space, the concept of holography is much more general, applying to any system with a bounding surface and an interior, or as physicists call it, a bulk that is contained within the boundary. A classical black box provides a suitable abstract example. The boundary of the black box can be taken to comprise only the degrees of freedom that encode the inputs to and the outputs from the box. This restricted notion of a boundary corresponds to the restricted notions of a system and an observer commonly employed in the discussions of environmental induced decoherence. In this case, the bulk of the black box comprises all of the known boundary degrees of freedom, in particular all of the degrees of freedom involved in the process of generating the next output in response to a given input. It is precisely these bulk degrees of freedom to which observers of a black box have no access. Indeed, Moore's theorem prevents them from determining any more than a low limit on the number of bulk degrees of freedom of a black box. The amount of information that can be obtained from a black box is strictly limited by the total coding capacity of its boundary degrees of freedom. This coding capacity can be expressed precisely as an abstract dimension. Let Xi be the set of mutually independent degrees of freedom of the boundary, and let N be the number of possible distinct values of the nth boundary degree of freedom, xi. The dimension of the boundary is then the sum of the numbers n over all degrees of freedom in xi. Well, to cut it short, what this equation, which is quite complicated, shows that for quantum mechanics to work, one of the main things is that the classical world exists, because it constructs many classical worlds in one world. And now you might understand why Tegmark is a friend here, because he states that, but then the different scientists goes in two different directions. Tegmark took the horrible path of the many worlds. He had to. But this shows that, oddly enough, this firm, real world is the basis of quantum mechanics. The sharedness in the world is made by quantum mechanics. And I could point in here, in the Newtonian model, it could never ever been shared. And I guess some of you have already come to that conclusion. There is no possibility to share a world in the Newtonian model. Newton points to some sort of solipsism. Listen to this, the only information that an observer can obtain about the surrounding environment is the information that can be encoded on the observer environment in interface by decoherence. The environment of any observer is therefore a black box and satisfies the holographic principle. The loop from figure 3 back to figure 1 is thus closed. From the environment's perspective, the observer also satisfies the holographic principle, as the environment can only obtain information about the observer that can be encoded on the observer environment boundary. Kaufman has obviously related the eigenvectors representing observable degrees of freedom and eigenvalues representing observable outcome as stable outcomes of repeated managements. Indeed, the stability of observational outcomes under exact repeated measurements underlies the notion of a system's preparation and is often regarded as an axiom of quantum theory. The above discussion localizes this conceptual connection to the observer-environment boundary, that is, the interface as described by ITP, and shows that the connection is implemented by decoherence, the process that creates stable classical records of transient quantum states. As discussed above, information is classical to the extent that it has an extent on decision and action. That is, to the extent that it is useful to the agent that receives it, Information that has no effect, information that changes nothing about its recipients, is information that has not been recorded. Gregory Bateson put it, what we mean by information, the elementary unit of information, is a difference which makes a difference. How aptly put by Bateson. All the information that agents possess is information that has had some effect on them. It is all pragmatic information in Juan Rödere's sense. Information that enables doing something. Von Förster makes a similar point, quoting Jerzy Konarski. Information and its utilization are inseparable, one process. So no information will be recorded information if it doesn't make a change. The change, it doesn't make sense to speak about the world if there is no change from the information. And this is this very, very important point they are sort of revealing. And it's called fitness. How the world fits you, what you want to make out of it, that makes the world real. Otherwise the world doesn't get recorded and thereby it doesn't get real. This is fitness. Now we've spoken about actual and expected fitness before. That is prime in contra what evolves, what becomes in the end. Interfaces therefore encode expected fitness. They encode their own best estimates of the likelihood of survival, i.e. the likelihood of receiving a next input and transmitting a next action. If interfaces encode information about fitness, then they do not encode information about the observer-independent ontology or causal structure of the world. In the present conceptual framework, of course, this is tautologos. There is no observer-independent ontology or causal structure in any world that is defined only relative to an observer. From the perspective of the classical worldview, however, this is a surprising result. It is supported by evolutionary game theory experiments that adopt the classical worldview insofar as they assign true world states in an agent-independent manner, but shows that agents that make decisions based on these true world states are generally driven to extinction by agents that make decisions solely on the basis of expected fitness. These empirical results have since been put on a rigorous footing by a fitness beats truth theorem, demonstrating that decision strategies based on expected fitness will dominate decision strategies based on the truth about the world for all but a generic small subset of fitness functions. The fitness beats truth theorem provides a formal justification for von Glarsefeld's remark that we must never say that our knowledge is true, in the sense that it reflects an ontologically real world. Making use of the computer interface analogy, Hoffman, Singh and Prakash characterize perceived objects as icons on an agent's interface. These icons encode packages of expected fitness consequence, what James Gibson called affordances. Though Gibson's tended to view affordances as objectively encoded by the environment. An icon that is a perceived coffee cup, for example, encodes the expected fitness of its own use for drinking coffee. They are useful to the extent that they support behaviors, at least approximate eigenbehaviors, that leave their structures at least approximately constant. As noted earlier with respect to experiences of actions, stable icons representing objects with identity over time or processes that unfold in time require some components of the experience set X to be allocated to distinct collections of memory and expectation experiences. As limits of an infinite recursive process, as well as fixed points for that very process, eigenforms are encodings of their own fitness that the icons manipulated by finite organisms only approximate. It is important to note that the information about expected fitness that icons encode is non-local. Actions taken with respect to one icon can have consequences for future interactions with others. One's actions with respect to a perceived kitchen knife, for example, can have consequences for how one interacts later with a perceived computer. An agent that stops interacting, moreover, stops interacting with everything. Such non-local effect suggest apparent causal relations between the icons themselves. Causation, in turn, suggests an apparent spacetime in which causal processes operate. Experience spacetime, however, must be encoded, like the icons themselves, on the interface. How is this done? Spacetime as an error-correcting code. As noted earlier, the agent-environment interface can be characterized in abstraction from any notion of ordinary three-dimensional space. Human perception, however, is resolutely spatial. The objects we see occupy space and move in space, and the action we take are taken in space. Human experience, moreover, unfolds in time. Where does this space-time come from? The recursion that gives rise to eigenforms provides a natural counter for time. This conception of time as an agent-specific counter for experience is built into the CA framework. What, however, about space? What is it about perception action interfaces that makes them spatial, and what explains three-dimensionality? We suggest that space, and by extension space-time, provides an error-correcting code for fitness consequences. A spatiotemporal encoding provides a way of spreading out information about fitness that allows redundancy and hence an ability to detect and correct perceptual errors. To see the value of spatial encoding, consider the information about quantity encoded by the positive whole numbers. These numbers are just discrete points on the real line, hence they can be represented simply as a sequence of points. This representation can even be compressed further. Such representations are, however, useless. There is no way to tell, for example, that point 1 represents 4, while point 2 represents 6. Making this distinction requires adding a spatial dimension that allows a planar character like 4 to be drawn out. This added dimension allows redundancy, as shown in figure 5. This added dimension allows redundancy, as shown in figure 5. An icon that is allowed to occupy space can have parts that each contribute to the icon's ability to communicate a message to the observer. Redundancy is the key to error correction, and hence to increasing the probability that the messages about fitness encoded by, for example, 4 and 27 can be distinguished. Merely repeating a symbol provides the simplest form of redundancy. For example, the code 11 reinforces the message 1. Three repeats have long been known to be better than 2, as in the long-standing Morse code emergency distress signal, or SOS. By convention, always repeated 3 times. To examine the use of redundancy, we first consider the simplest case, a binary code. For a binary code, the Hamming distance provides a convenient measure of the dissimilarity of distance between encoded symbols. The codes 111 for 3 and 000 for O, no, the code 11 for S and the 100 for O are, for example, separated by a Hamming distance of 3. 3 bit flips are required to transform one message into another. The redundancy of such a code provides a natural sense of spatial dimensionality, as shown in Figure 6. The redundancy of such a code provides a natural sense of spatial dimensionality, as shown in Figure 6. Sorry to repeat it, but I'm just so gobsmacked. Here, flipping a bit is traveling in a direction on a graph. The bits are independent, so the directions are orthogonal. As can be seen in Figure 6, a 3-bit binary code provides the possibility of error correction. Every message with a mixed bits has a 67% likelihood of being one pure bit message and only 33% likelihood of being the other, while the 2-bit code does not. Hence, a threefold redundancy, the minimum for error correction utility utilizing a binary code. At the very basis of human perception is a binary question. Is something there or not? It is this question that distinguishes an object from an undifferentiated background. We suggest that the need to answer this simple binary question accurately requires the error correction capability of a triply redundant encoding, and hence a 3-dimensional Hamming space. Systems that must answer more complex questions can be expected to employ greater redundancy. This added redundancy comes, however, at a cost. Redundant encodings require more degrees of freedom and hence a higher D-boundary. Distinguishing the values of these additional degrees of freedom requires, moreover, an energy expenditure of at least n times ln2 times kt per distinction, where n is the number of bits required to encode each distinguishable value. K is Boltzmann's constant, and T is absolute temperature. Organisms such as humans do not encode one-to-one eigenform to eigenbehavior relationships. There are many different uses for a screwdriver or a coffee cup, and one can reach for and grasp many different objects. We suggest that organisms faced with the task of encoding such complex relationships devote some of their available interface redundancy to encoding eigenform persistence over time, and the rest to encoding eigenform actionability. For example, some degrees of freedom are devoted to handling that coffee cup is present, while others devote to encoding whether or how it can be grasped. Encodings of persistence and actionability are subject to different constraints. An action type like grasping may be executed in a large number of ways, only one of which may yield positive fitness, getting one's coffee, input in a particular situation. Accurately selecting the one right high fitness grasp from the large number of possible grasps requires a redundant encoding, but redundantly encoding many distance grasps is expensive. One might expect, therefore, organisms to employ the minimal redundancy that provides error correction. Threefold redundancy for action encoding. These are the three dimensions. Assuming a continuous range of grasps, a threefold redundant encoding is an encoding into real ordered triples, and hence into real free space. Discretizing the possible grasps voxelites this space. Employing a distinct real or an high-resolution discrete free space of each of a large number of action types would, however, be very expensive both for the encoding perception and for memory. One would therefore expect organisms to overlay the encoding so as to encode many different action types in the same space. Whether this is possible depends on the composability of actions and the existence of inverse actions. That is, whether the action space supports a group structure. It has been shown within the CA framework that the group structure of the action space, G, induces one of the interface X. Hence, it's plausible to suggest that the threefold encoding redundancy and a group structure of actions is sufficient to generate an interface with free extended spatial dimensions in which actions are represented. The encoding of eigenform persistence, on the other hand, is subject only to the constraint of being good enough to support appropriate actions. One can therefore expect a quasi-hierarchical encoding in which resolution can be varied to suit observational context. The encoding of eigenform persistence, on the other hand, is subject only to the constraint of being good enough to support appropriate actions. One can therefore expect a quasi-hierarchical encoding in which resolution can be varied to suit observational context. As this encoding must fit into spatially organized interface, one expects a spatial encoding in which the spatial dimensions associated with a particular eigenform are not extended over the entire interface, but are rather compressed into only a small part of the interface. A compressed spatial structure is a shape like 4 in figure 5, that occupies space and redundantly encodes persistence. Mammalian visual and auditory systems use distinct processing streams for action and object perception, consistent with the prediction above. Objects are indeed categorized quasi-hierarchical. The shapes of both natural and artificial objects can often be represented by scalable codes, such as crystal structures, Fibonacci numbers, or fractals. The idea that space-time itself is emergent from underlying quantum and information theoretic constraints is now being taken seriously by physicists. Swingle, Arkani Ahmed, Trinka and Pastavsky et al., just to give some examples. Conclusion. In this paper introducing the it from bit concept from John Wheeler, who insisted that we could call existence is an information theoretic entity, later quoting Gottfried Leibniz, time and space are not things, but orders of things. And Einstein, time and space are modes by which we think and not conditions in which we live. In support of this fourth, no space, no time, von Förster could well have added, space-time is the eigenform that by remaining constant enables actions. To these we have added eigenform, eigenbehavior loops, and hence the interfaces through which they pass, encode information about fitness and hence persistence. Spacetime itself, therefore, is an encoding of fitness. It exists only because it is useful to organisms going about the business of staying alive. Organisms with different structures and lifestyle, as different as E. coli, an oak tree, and a person, may experience very different space-times. It remains, however, to extract from this idea predictions of sufficient power and precision that, confirming them, would overcome the intuitive appeal of an objective space-time filled with objective objects. The stubborn resistance of the classical worldview in face of 8 decades of quantum theory, experiments and technology shows that this will not be easy. Well, I can agree. Bringing these ideas into science and hence technology of perception itself may yet, however, open the door to empirical demonstrations that cannot be denied. Well, that shows that space-time is, in the eyes of Wegener and also the authors of this article, Chris Field, Hoffman. Hoffman is very often on internet these days. You can find his fantastic TED lectures and other lectures on the internet. Well recommended. He's a very good speaker as well. But that goes to show that we are actually half a step into this already with Einstein, although Einstein pushed it away. But with quantum mechanics, information that is not useful for the object cannot really be called information. Nothing is information that is not useful. Fitness and time and space in this scheme becomes regulating fitness protocol, something to care about irregularities, or an error correcting scheme. And in the diagrams it was shown how by having 3 dimensions you can assure, like the Morse code, that the message actually goes through, that there is no stopping of the messaging. It's very important to realize that, because it's an important step towards real space and real time. Space couldn't be real if it didn't affect the object or the objective observer. If it doesn't mean anything for me, if I don't record anything, how could it be an observation? And I can only record what is in my fitness scheme. Everything outside of that wouldn't really make any sense. It wouldn't work. This, however, the perspective from Chris Fields, Hoffman, and also, of course, Wegener, makes a lot of more sense. It cannot be other way. This is my first take on it. I'm just gobsmacked so far. Of course, I have to go further into this, but it is incredibly compelling so far. This really goes to show that we need to look in much closer to what we have constructed. Goes to show also the importance this non-informational field is the real field of informational transferal. This is what we really do when we want to make something valid. And in the old model, which didn't make any sense at all, but we had to stick to it, as long as there are no alternatives. The classical model rules. That's what makes this apologetics so vain, egotistical, and boisterous, shouting arguments when everything of reduction is already established. When it sort of doesn't make any sense whatsoever to say that we live in a world that means anything to us. How could we have a meaningless Newtonian space? Empty, homogeneous, where we put things in. It's part of a disease. Newtonian take is the system in a disease, not healthy state. Because we need to understand it's an information field in 3 different levels. Just like the Morse code, it wouldn't tell us anything otherwise. And what would the reason be to have space-time if it didn't tell anything to us? That's a gut reaction I have directly here. Why would it be at all if it didn't really do anything for us? It's an absolutely all-important basis. And if we don't have that basis, it's a question, what would we then have? This is the foundation that we need to build everything on. A meaningful space-time where our observations doesn't change the space-time, but it's one step further. We take use of it. They are fitness things. They are a redundancy, and that redundancy we call 3 dimensions. But it's an actual informational redundancy. Use that, take good use of it. And all of a sudden, the whole traumatized system of the pre-Socratic Greek becomes whole again. It becomes healthy. It becomes salutagenous. It has an importance for you. While living in a Newtonian universe where the observer, you, don't use the information that is available, and still it's regarded to be existent, real, working full, it is just crazy. It cannot work that way. I will try to make another summary. I see there is another part here. I'll continue with that one. It was very interesting, this. I'm sorry I stopped for a while and slowed down the progress, but I was myself gobsmacked with the revelations. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.